Welcome to the preview for Chapter 10, Chapter 10, Section 1. Chapter 10 is the Union in Peril. Chapter deals with the conflicts that and the tension that's increasing over slavery and some other regional tensions that as we see, will lead directly to the Civil War. Some of how we'll be interacting with history while we explore Chapter 10. We'll be able to clarify the economic importance of slavery in the South. We'll also be able to analyze the complexities of the conflict between human rights and the sanctity of property. So one of the pieces that we're going to find early on in Chapter 10 is the whole notion of having to deal with slaves as property. Some of the issues, we'll be examining differences between the fundamental assumptions made by slaveholding Southerners and those made by abolitionists, most of whom lived in the North, who advanced the human rights of African Americans. We'll also be discussing how essential slavery was to the plantation economy, and what options there might have been for a peaceful resolution of the slavery issue. Section 1 takes a look at the divisive politics of slavery. The main idea here is the whole fact that the issue of slavery is dominating U.S. politics in the early 50s. Why that's important for us to be studying now in our U.S. history class is the fact that the U.S. society continues to be challenged by issues of fairness, equality, race, and class. The objectives for Section 1. First, I can describe the growing differences between the North and South in their economies and their ways of life. This is an exploration we began earlier in the fall, and it continues to have an impact. Number 2, I can explain why the Wilmot Proviso failed to pass. This was an effort to contain the slavery issue. 3, I can explain why the issue of California statehood became so important. Again, slavery is a primary focus of the tensions with California statehood. And 4, I can analyze how the efforts of Clay, Webster, and Douglas produced the Compromise of 1850 and a temporary halt to talk of secession. Terms and names for Section 1. Secession, decision by a state to leave the Union. The Wilmot Proviso, a bill that would ban slavery in the territories acquired after the war with Mexico. The Compromise of 1850, a series of measures that were intended to settle the disagreements between free states and slave states. Popular sovereignty, an idea that people living in a territory should make their own decisions, especially the decision to admit slavery to their state. Stephen A. Douglas, senator from Illinois who worked to pass the Compromise of 1850, and Millard Fillmore, the 13th President of the United States. Objective 1 of Section 1. I can describe the growing differences between the North and the South in their economies and ways of life. Well, as we discovered in our earlier exploration of the North and South, the North was primarily industrial. And by the early 50s, it had become even more so. It now had over 20,000 miles of railroad track. It had large cities and contained a number of factories. As a result of the factories in the cities, many immigrants were coming north to find those jobs, and most of those immigrants opposed slavery. Meanwhile, the South remained rural and agricultural, plantations still the focus of life in the South. There were few immigrants to the South, and those people who were in the South owning land were in support of slavery. I can explain why the Wilmot Proviso failed to pass, our second objective for Section 1. The Wilmot Proviso was a bill introduced in Congress to ban slavery in the new territories acquired from Mexico. Now, Northerners, they favored the bill, and one of the prime reasons they failed is they didn't want slave states having too much power. So in other words, they didn't want there to be any more slave states. Southerners were opposed to the bill, and they argued that since slaves were property, and by virtue of property protected by the Constitution, they had a right to slavery in the new states. The thinking by the Southerners was something like this: if I move to a new territory, I bring my slaves with me, they're property, therefore I have a right to have my slaves in those territories. Objective 3, I can explain why the issue of California statehood became so important. Well, in 1849, California asked to be admitted as a free state. Southerners thought that it should be a slave state because of an earlier measure that was introduced to control slave and free states, that being the Missouri Compromise line, because most of the state of California lay south of the Missouri Compromise. Southerners were arguing it should be a slave state. President Zachary Taylor, he believed that California should be a free state. He believed that actually the climate and the terrain of California were not suited to slavery. And Taylor also believed that Southerners should leave the issue of slavery up to individual territories rather than Congress. His argument there was that Congress had a number of abolitionist members and it would be difficult to have any decisions made in favor of slavery. Southerners saw the whole move in terms of California being admitted as a free state as an attack on slavery and on their very way of life. The fourth objective, I can analyze how the efforts of Clay, Webster, and Douglas produced the Compromise of 1850 and a temporary halt to the talk of secession. Well, in 1849, the 31st Congress opened. There were three primary matters in front of them. One was the question of statehood for California. Another dispute was the North demanding the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. And the third was Southerners accusing the North of failing to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. The tensions were strong enough at this point that Southern states began threatening secession, the formal withdrawal from the Union. In Congress, Henry Clay of Kentucky presented the Compromise of 1850. And the compromise consisted of a number of components. One, to please the North, California would be admitted as a free state. To satisfy the South, the compromise called for a stricter fugitive slave law. And this law would require Northerners to return escaped slaves to their masters. Also, Northerners were happy with a provision that gave popular sovereignty to the territories of New Mexico and Utah. This would allow the territories to decide for themselves. Southerners actually were okay with this as well. And another part of the compromise, the federal government would pay Texas $10 million to surrender its claim on New Mexico. Northerners liked this provision because they felt it would in effect limit slavery in Texas to its current borders. For Southerners, the money would help offset Texas expenses and debts from the war with Mexico. So Congress debated this compromise, the Compromise of 1850, for months. The North was represented by Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, and they supported the plan. The South, represented by John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, opposed the compromise, and the compromise failed to pass. Stephen A. Douglas then took action, and he was able to actually get the compromise through Congress by submitting each part of the plan as a separate bill. And the unexpected death of President Taylor aided Douglas's efforts because Millard Fillmore became the new president and he supported the compromise. So it finally did become law. However, it did not settle the issue of slavery for long. And this concludes our review, our preview of Section 1.